Today we are going to discuss about the clinical trial phases for a new developments of a drugs. What is clinical trials? Clinical trials are the research project to determine how well a new treatment or medical procedure works in people. Usually, the investigations in which people volunteer to test new treatments, interventions or tests as a means to prevent, detect, treat or manage various diseases or medical conditions. Some investigations look at how people respond to a new interventions and what side effects might occur. So the purpose of clinical trials is to answer scientific questions. Therefore, these studies follow strict scientific standards which protect patients and help produce reliable clinical trials results. Clinical trials are one of the final stages of a long and careful research and development process. So why is it so important? Clinical trials are an important step in discovering new treatments for breast cancer and other diseases, as well as new ways to detect, diagnose, and reduce the risk of a disease. Clinical trials show researchers what does and doesn't work in people. Clinical trials also help researchers and doctors to decide if the side effects of a new treatment are acceptable when weighed against the benefits offered by the new treatment. Clinical trials related to drugs are classified into 4 phases. The trials at each phase have a different purpose and help scientists answer different questions. Phase 1 trials test an experimental drugs, vaccine or device in a small group of people to evaluate the safety, possible side effects and to determine how the drug should be used or delivered. Then, Phase 2 trials involve more people than Phase 1 and they are designed to assess the safety and efficacy of an experimental treatment. This phase can last several years. Next is Phase 3 trials. They are usually large studies with many participants. This phase compares the experimental drug or vaccines to a placebo or standard treatment to evaluate the safety and efficacy. Some side effects that were not identified in Phase 2 may be identified in Phase 3. The regulatory health authorities such as the US Food and Drug Administration will consider the results of clinical trial up to and including Phase 3 trials when determining whether to approve a new drug or vaccine. Lastly is Phase 4 trials that take place after a regulatory health authority such as the FDA has approved the use of the drug or vaccine. A drug's effectiveness and safety are monitored in large diverse populations. Please note that every clinical trial has a protocol or study plan that describes what will be done during the clinical trial, how the clinical trial will be conducted, and why each part of the clinical trial is necessary. The protocol or study plan also includes guidelines called eligibility criteria for who can and cannot participate in the clinical trials. Next, we are going to talk about IND, which is also known as an investigational new drugs. So this is actually an application to FDA to seek permission to test a new drugs in a human. During a new drug's early preclinical development, the sponsor's primary goal is to determine if the product is reasonably safe for initial use in humans and if the compound exhibits pharmacological activities that justify commercial development. When a product is identified as a viable candidate for further development, the sponsor then focuses on collecting the data and information necessary to establish that the product will not expose humans to unreasonable risk when used in limited early-stage clinical studies. In a short note, the IND is not an application for marketing approval. Rather, it is a request for an exemption from the federal statute that prohibits an unapproved drug from being shipped in interstate commerce. Current federal law requires that a drug be the subject of an approved marketing application before it is transported or distributed across the state lines. This is because a sponsor will probably want to ship the investigational drug to clinical investigators in many states. Therefore, it must seek an exemption from that legal requirement. The IND is the means through which the sponsor technically obtains these exemptions from the FDA. However, its main purpose is to detail the data that provide documentation that is indeed reasonable to proceed with certain human trials with the drugs. There are three types of IND application. Firstly, an investigator IND that is submitted by a physician and under whose immediate directions and conducts an investigation drug is administered or dispensed. Next is emergency use IND, which is to allow time for submissions of IND in accordance with law that have been set by the FDA. It is also used for patients who do not meet the criteria of an existing study protocol or an approved study that do not exist. Lastly is treatment IND, which is an experimental drugs that show promise in clinical testing for serious or immediately life-threatening conditions while the final clinical work is conducted and the FDA review takes place. These are some important IND applications area. Firstly is animal pharmacology and toxicology study, which is to permit an assessment as to whether the product is reasonably safe for initial testing in humans. Next is manufacturing information, which is an information pertaining to the composition, manufacturer, stability and control used for manufacturing the drug substances and the drug product. This information is assessed to ensure that the company can adequately produce and supply consistent batches of the drugs. Last but not least is clinical protocols and investigator information, which is a detailed protocols for proposed clinical studies to assess whether the initial phase trial will expose subjects to unnecessary risk. Next, these are the 5 FDA IND review team. First is project manager, medical officer, statistician, pharmacologist, pharmacokineticist, chemist, and microbiologist. So how can we apply for IND? These are the example form that you can find from the website. For example, these are the IND application form that is taken from the website. Now we are going to explain on the phases of the clinical trials. First, it starts with phase 1. During phase 1 studies, researchers test a new drugs in normal volunteers, healthy people. In most cases, 20 to 80 healthy volunteers or people with the disease or condition participate in phase 1. However, if a new drug is intended for the disease such as cancer patients, researchers conduct phase 1 studies in patients with that type of cancer. Phase 1 studies are closely monitored and gather information about how a drug interacts with the human body. Researchers adjust dosing schemes based on the animal data to find how much of a drug the body can tolerate and what its acute side effects. As the phase 1 trial continues, it will go to a phase 2 studies. The purpose of clinical phase 1 is to investigate the safety or tolerability, pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics of an investigational drugs in humans. Next is clinical phase 2. In phase 2 studies, researchers administer the drug to a group of patients with the disease or condition for which the drug is being developed. Typically, involving a few hundred patients, these studies aren't large enough to show whether the drug will be beneficial. Instead, phase 2 studies provide researchers with additional safety data. Researchers use the data to refine research questions, develop research methods, and design new phase 3 research protocols. Phase 3. It is divided into Phase 3A and Phase 3B. For the Phase 3A, it is also known as a proof of efficacy trial. It confirms the preliminary evidence accumulated in Phase 2. It is a large-scale testing that involves randomized and blind testing in several hundred to several thousand patients. Only 1/3 of the drugs can make it till this phase. However, these trials are the longest and the largest of all the studies conducted, and it took around 2 to 5 years to complete this phase. In this phase, it tests the ultimate safety, efficacy, and dosage of the drugs as compared with the best currently available treatment, which is the gold standard treatment. They also compare the risk and benefits ratio and route of administered. It provides the pharmaceutical company and the FDA with a more thorough understanding of the effectiveness, safeness, and quality of the drugs or device, the benefits, and the range of possible adverse reactions. After completing Phase 3, all data must be submitted for a new drug applications. What is NDA? NDA is the vehicle through which drug sponsor formally propose that the FDA approve a new pharmaceutical for sale and marketing in the US. The goals of the NDA are to provide enough information to permit FDA reviewer to reach the following key decisions: proposed labeling, safety updates, drug abuse informations, patent informations, benefits, and risk ratio. So these are the flowchart how the application form is processed. Once FDA receive an NDA, the review team decide if it is complete. If it is not complete, the review team can refuse to file the NDA. If it's complete, the review team has 6 to 10 months to make a decision on whether to approve the drugs. The process includes each member of the review team conducts a full review of his or her sections of the applications. The FDA inspectors travel to clinical study sites to conduct a routine inspections. The agency looks for evidence of fabrications, manipulations, or withholding of data. Then, the project manager assembles all individual reviews and other documents into a record for FDA review. The review team issues a recommendation and a senior FDA official makes a decision. Then, Phase 3B, which is conducted after submissions of NDA but before getting approval from FDA. This phase is conducted to obtain additional data to support the previous submitted NDA. However, FDA approval may occur prior to the completion of this phase, but Phase 3B must also be completed and all results must be submitted to regulatory authorities. Last but not least is Phase 4. It is also known as a post-marketing surveillance or therapeutic use trial, which FDA require the companies monitor approved medicines for as long as they stay on the market and require companies to submit periodic reports on the safety and tolerability. This phase conduct after the FDA approves the marketing of a new drugs. The main goal of running these trials are to find out the long-term side effects and safety in a greater number of patients, drugs and drugs interactions, long-term risk and benefits, rare and serious adverse effects. Last but not least is more information from the special group, for example, pregnant women, elderly, and children.